I am Mason, 29 years old, and until 3 months ago, I thought I understood what family meant. When my grandmother passed, she left me her beautiful Boston home, a place filled with childhood memories. Never did I imagine my own father would sell it behind my back. The real gut punch came when he looked me straight in the eyes and casually said, "The money will go to pay off your brother Trevor's vacation." Before I tell you how this whole mess unfolded, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had family try to take what's rightfully yours. Growing up, my grandmother Elaine was my rock. Her Victorian house in Boston, with its creaky wooden floors and stained glass windows, became my sanctuary, especially during weekends when Dad took Trevor fishing or to baseball games. Those father-son trips never included me. The pattern was established early on that Trevor was the golden child while I remained in the shadows despite my efforts. My father Richard always had a special bond with Trevor. They shared the same boisterous love for sports and carefree attitude toward life. Meanwhile, I inherited my mother and grandmother's temperament, more reserved and thoughtful. Dad never understood my interest in architecture and design. When I spent hours sketching buildings instead of watching football, he would shake his head and mumble something about me being too much like your mother. Despite earning straight A's throughout school, winning a full scholarship to study architecture at Northwestern and landing internships at prestigious firms, my achievements rarely received more than a perfunctory nod from my father. Trevor, on the other hand, dropped out of community college after 2 semesters. Yet Dad celebrated his every minor accomplishment like he had discovered the cure for cancer. The pattern of favoritism extended to financial matters, too. Trevor developed expensive tastes early on, maxing out credit cards for designer clothes, electronic gadgets, and weekend trips with friends. Each time he landed in financial trouble, Dad swooped in to bail him out. "He's just finding himself," Dad would explain, writing yet another check. When I needed money for architecture books or software, Dad suggested I learn the value of hard work by getting a part-time job. Our family dynamic changed dramatically when Mom died from cancer when I was 15. She had been the buffer between Dad and me, the translator who helped us understand each other. Without her, the distance between us grew even wider. Trevor, then 17, became Dad's emotional crutch, and their bond strengthened while I drifted further into the background. Grandmother Elaine recognized what was happening. She lived just across town and began inviting me over more frequently after Mom passed. "Your father loves you," she would assure me, while teaching me to bake her famous apple pie, or helping with my geometry homework. "He just doesn't know how to show it to someone so different from himself." Her Victorian house became my second home. Built in 1895 with ornate trim and a wraparound porch, the house sat on a tree-lined street in one of Boston's historic neighborhoods. The library room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves became my favorite spot to study. Grandmother would bring me hot chocolate and sit quietly reading while I worked on school projects. "This house has stories in its walls," she once told me. "Someday it will be yours, and you can add your own chapters to its history." I didn't take her comment seriously then, assuming it was just a sweet sentiment from a loving grandmother. After graduating college, I accepted a position with an architectural firm in Chicago. The distance from Boston provided space to build my own identity away from the shadow of family dynamics. I established myself professionally, made new friends, and created a life independent from the constant comparison to Trevor. Still, I called grandmother weekly and flew back to Boston for major holidays and her birthday. During those visits, I avoided spending too much time at Dad's house, preferring the peaceful atmosphere at grandmother's. She proudly displayed my architectural drawings and kept a scrapbook of my professional accomplishments. Trevor, meanwhile, bounced between jobs, relationships, and apartments. At 31, he still received regular financial support from Dad, who explained it away as temporary assistance, despite the pattern lasting well over a decade. The last time I visited before grandmother's death, Trevor had just been fired from a sales position for showing up late repeatedly. Yet somehow, Dad twisted this into a story about Trevor being too creative for a structured environment. The house itself had appreciated significantly in value over the decades. Located in a now trendy neighborhood, similar homes were selling for around $800,000. But to me, its value was primarily sentimental, a connection to Mom and grandmother, and the only place I truly felt at home. During my final visit with grandmother, she seemed to know her time was limited, though doctors had given no such indication. She took my hand and spoke more directly than usual. "Mason, I've watched you grow into a thoughtful, hard-working young man. Your mother would be so proud of you." She paused, squeezing my hand. "I've updated my will. This house will be yours when I'm gone. It's always been your true home, and I know you'll honor its history." I tried to protest uncomfortable discussing inheritance while she was still vibrant despite her 82 years, but she waved away my objections. "It's all arranged. Richard knows my wishes. The house goes to you, and my financial assets will be split between you and Trevor." Her eyes held mine firmly. "Promise me you'll stand up for yourself if necessary. Your father means well, but he has blind spots when it comes to your brother." I promised, never imagining how soon and how severely that promise would be tested. The call came on a Tuesday morning 3 months ago. Grandmother had passed peacefully in her sleep. I immediately booked a flight to Boston, arriving just hours before Trevor and Dad showed up at the house. The initial interaction was awkward but civil, our shared grief temporarily suspending the usual family tensions. The funeral took place 2 days later. It was well attended, a testament to how many lives grandmother had touched in her community. I delivered the eulogy, something Dad didn't contest, despite Trevor's subtle suggestion that he should do it since he knew her longer. Several of grandmother's friends approached me afterward, sharing stories about how often she spoke of me with pride. The reading of the will occurred the following week in the office of grandmother's attorney, Mr. Winters. As she had told me, the house was left explicitly to me, while her financial assets, approximately $300,000, were to be divided equally between Trevor and me. Dad sat stiffly as Mr. Ne2- Winters read these terms but offered no objection. Trevor's expression darkened momentarily before he composed himself. "Congratulations," Dad said afterward, his tone neutral. "Your grandmother always did have a soft spot for you." "The house should stay in the family," I replied carefully. "That's what she wanted." Trevor interjected. "So what are your plans? Selling it and taking the cash back to Chicago?" There was an edge to his question that I chose to ignore. "No, I'm thinking about renovating and possibly moving back. I'd need to figure out job possibilities here first." To my surprise, Dad nodded approvingly. "It's a valuable property. Smart to hold on to it, especially in that neighborhood." The conversation felt like a tentative truce, the first time in years that Dad had endorsed one of my decisions. As we parted ways, I allowed myself to hope that grandmother's passing might somehow begin a healing process in our fractured family. The next few weeks were busy, as I took personal leave from my Chicago firm to begin organizing grandmother's affairs. The house needed some updating. The electrical system was outdated, and the kitchen hadn't been renovated since the 90s, but its bones were solid. I contacted several contractors for estimates, envisioning how I might modernize certain aspects while preserving the historical character grandmother had so carefully maintained. During this time, an unexpected opportunity arose at work. The Chicago firm offered me a junior partner position, something I'd been working toward for years. The timing complicated my tentative plans to return to Boston, creating a new tension between professional advancement and the pull of family history embedded in grandmother's house. I called Dad to discuss the dilemma, another rare moment of reaching out for his input. "That's impressive, son," he said, sounding genuinely pleased. "Would they let you work remotely, part of the time? You could keep the house as a second home until you figure things out?" His supportive response caught me off guard and fueled my optimism about our relationship. Maybe grandmother's final gift wasn't just the house, but a chance for Dad and me to find new common ground. Each day spent in the house strengthened my emotional connection to it. I discovered boxes of family photographs in the attic, including many of Mom that I'd never seen. I found grandmother's collection of letters, including correspondence with my grandfather during World War II. The house wasn't just a building, but a repository of family history. Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly neighbor who had been friends with grandmother for decades, stopped by regularly with home-cooked meals and stories about the neighborhood's history. During one visit, she mentioned seeing Dad at the house recently. "Your father was here with some official-looking man last week," she said casually. "I assumed he was helping you with paperwork or something similar." The comment struck me as odd since Dad hadn't mentioned visiting the house, but I was busy sorting through grandmother's belongings and didn't give it much thought. Maybe he was just checking on the property or helping with some administrative detail I'd overlooked. Trevor remained surprisingly quiet during this period. He texted occasionally asking generic questions about how the house clearing was going, but made no offers to help and didn't visit. In one call, he mentioned planning a much-needed vacation now that his portion of the inheritance was coming through. I wished him well, glad that he seemed to be accepting the terms of grandmother's will without resentment. As I settled into a routine at the house, I began to envision my future there more concretely. One of the bedrooms could become a home office, allowing me to work remotely part-time if the Chicago firm agreed. The sunroom overlooking the garden would make a perfect drafting space with natural light streaming through the bay windows. For the first time since grandmother's passing, I felt a sense of purpose and direction. I even invited Dad over for dinner, cooking grandmother's signature roast chicken recipe. He seemed genuinely engaged as I showed him my preliminary renovation plans, offering practical suggestions about local contractors and permit requirements. The evening ended with him patting my shoulder awkwardly but affectionately, a gesture that felt like progress. "Your grandmother would approve of what you're doing here," he said as he left. "She always believed you had good judgment." Those words, so unlike his usual dismissive attitude toward my decisions, reinforced my growing hope that inheriting the house might be a turning point in our relationship. I fell asleep that night feeling more connected to my family legacy than ever before, unaware that the foundation of that connection was already being undermined. The call from Mrs. Abernathy came early on a Monday morning, her voice trembling with concern. "Mason, dear, there are people at your house moving furniture out. Big moving truck in the driveway. I thought you should know right away." My first thought was burglary. "Did you call the police?" "No, they have a company logo on their uniforms. Very official looking. The new owners are here too, measuring for curtains," they said. The words "new owners" hit me like a physical blow. What new owners? The house isn't sold. That's why I called, dear. They said they closed on the house last week. Young couple seem very nice, but I was certain you planned to keep the property. I immediately tried calling Dad, but the call went straight to voicemail. Same with Trevor. With growing panic, I booked the next flight to Boston, 3 agonizing hours during which my mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. The taxi from Logan Airport crawled through traffic as I repeatedly tried reaching Dad. When we finally turned onto Grandmother's Street, the sight that greeted me confirmed my worst fears. A sold sticker was plastered across the "for sale" sign in the front yard. The moving truck Mrs. Abernathy mentioned was being loaded with grandmother's antique dining set. I rushed toward the house, confronting a startled moving man. "Stop, this is my house. There's been a mistake." A woman in her 30s emerged from the front door. "Excuse me, who are you?" "I'm Mason Wright. This is my house. I inherited it from my grandmother." Her expression shifted from confusion to sympathy. "Oh, you must be Richard's son. He mentioned you might be upset. I'm Laura Delaney. My husband and I purchased the house last week." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "That's impossible. My father had no right to sell this house. It was left to me in my grandmother's will." Laura looked uncomfortable. "I don't know what to tell you. We have all the proper documentation. The sale is complete, and we've already transferred the full amount." I demanded the name of their real estate agent, who reluctantly shared the sale details when I tracked her down by phone. The house had been listed 3 weeks earlier and sold for $760,000, well below market value for a quick sale. The paperwork had been processed through Wilson and Barrett Real Estate, with Richard Wright listed as the legal seller through power of attorney. Power of attorney. The phrase echoed in my head as I stood on the sidewalk watching strangers continue to empty my grandmother's house. My house of its contents. I had signed no such document, which could only mean one thing: forgery. I found a hotel room nearby and spent the afternoon making frantic calls to legal offices, most of which couldn't see me without an appointment. By evening, I had gathered enough information to confirm my suspicions. Someone had created fraudulent power of attorney documents, giving Dad control over the property, given the timing of Mrs. Abernathy's mention of Dad visiting with an official-looking man I suspected a notary had been involved in the deception. At 7:30 that evening, I drove to Dad's house, my hands shaking with rage and disbelief. Trevor's car sat in the driveway alongside Dad's. Of course they were together. They were always together. Dad opened the door with a beer in hand, his expression shifting from welcome to wariness when he saw my face. "Mason, didn't know you were coming by. No mention of the house. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. You sold grandmother's house." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, tight with suppressed fury. He sighed, stepping back to let me in. "Come inside. No need to discuss family business on the porch." Trevor lounged on the sofa, looking up from his phone with practiced innocence that couldn't quite hide the smugness in his eyes. "You forged my signature on power of attorney documents," I continued, ignoring Trevor completely. "You sold property that legally belongs to me." Dad had the audacity to look annoyed rather than guilty. "Sit down, Mason. You're overreacting." "Overreacting. You committed fraud. You stole my inheritance. Where's the money, Dad?" He took a long swig of beer before answering. "The money will go to pay off Trevor's vacation debts. He got himself into a bit of trouble in the Mediterranean." The casual way he said it, as if discussing a minor scheduling inconvenience rather than theft of nearly $800,000, left me momentarily speechless. Trevor interjected. "It wasn't just a vacation. It was an investment opportunity that didn't pan out." "Investment opportunity," I repeated flatly. "What kind of investment requires a Mediterranean cruise?" Dad waved his hand dismissively. "Some casino development deal. The details aren't important. What matters is Trevor owes some dangerous people about $200,000. So you stole my house to pay off his gambling debts. What about the other $560,000? There are penalties for early loan repayment, legal fees, and Trevor needs a cushion to get back on his feet." Dad spoke as if explaining simple mathematics to a child. "Besides, you're doing fine in Chicago. You don't need the house." "It's not about needing it. Grandmother left it to me. It was legally mine." Dad's expression hardened. "Your grandmother didn't understand the full situation. Trevor needs this money more than you do. You've always landed on your feet." The implication was clear. My independence and success were being used against me, while Trevor's repeated failures were once again being rewarded. The injustice of it burned in my chest. So because I worked hard and made something of myself, I deserve to have my inheritance stolen, while Trevor gambles away a fortune and gets bailed out again. Trevor stood up, finally dropping the innocent act. "Not everyone has it as easy as you, golden boy. Some of us have to take risks to get ahead." "Easy," I laughed bitterly. "Nothing has ever been easy. I just didn't expect handouts every time I screwed up." Dad stepped between us. "That's enough. What's done is done. The house is sold. The new owners seem like nice people who will take good care of it." The finality in his voice made the betrayal complete. He felt no remorse, no acknowledgement of the moral and legal lines he had crossed. In his mind, taking from me to give to Trevor was not just justified, but right. As I turned to leave, Trevor called after me. "Thanks for the bailout, bro. Maybe I'll send you a postcard from my next cruise." I didn't respond. There were no words adequate for the depth of betrayal I felt walking out of that house. My father had not only stolen my inheritance, but had done so with the belief that he was entitled to redistribute my grandmother's final gift as he saw fit. The family I thought I knew had revealed themselves to be strangers willing to commit fraud against one of their own. Driving back to the hotel, I made a decision. This wouldn't stand. For once in my life, I wouldn't quietly accept being sidelined in favor of Trevor. This time I would fight back. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake in the sterile hotel room, replaying the confrontation with Dad and Trevor, each recollection bringing fresh waves of anger and disbelief. How could my own father forge my signature? How could he justify stealing something explicitly left to me in grandmother's will? The casual way he announced the money would go to Trevor's gambling debts kept replaying in my mind, his tone suggesting I should find this perfectly reasonable. Morning brought no clarity, only the gritty-eyed exhaustion of emotional upheaval. I called my boss in Chicago requesting an emergency extension of my leave. To his credit, he heard the distress in my voice and granted 2 more weeks without pressing for details. My first action was scheduling a consultation with a local attorney. The earliest available appointment was 3 days away, an eternity given the circumstances. While waiting, I began gathering what information I could. I visited the county records office, confirming the sale had indeed been processed with alarming speed. The power of attorney document bore a signature that resembled mine, but contained subtle differences that any detailed forensic analysis would reveal as fraudulent. With growing horror, I also discovered Dad had accessed grandmother's bank accounts before they could be frozen and distributed according to the will. Nearly $30,000 had been withdrawn 2 days after her funeral money that should have been divided between Trevor and me. I called Mr. Winter's grandmother's attorney, but his receptionist informed me he was on vacation for 2 weeks. His junior associate could only confirm that the will had been properly filed, but offered no assistance regarding the fraudulent sale. When I returned to my hotel that evening, Trevor was waiting in the lobby. His typical swagger was tempered with caution as he approached. "Look, I know you're upset," he began, maintaining a careful distance. "But try to see this from Dad's perspective. He's just trying to balance things out between us." "Balance things out by committing fraud." My voice rose, drawing glances from nearby guests. Trevor lowered his voice. "Keep it down, would you? I'm trying to help you save face here. Fighting this will just tear the family apart and embarrass everyone." "The family?" I laughed bitterly. "What family?" "The one where Dad forges my signature to steal my inheritance. That family." "You're being dramatic. It's just a house. You weren't even planning to live in it full time." "It was grandmother's home. She left it to me not to pay off your gambling debts." Trevor's expression hardened. "It wasn't gambling. It was business networking. Those contacts will pay off eventually." $200,000 of networking on a Mediterranean cruise. Who exactly were you networking with? Casino owners? His silence confirmed my suspicion. "You never change, Trevor, and Dad never stops enabling you." I turned to walk away. "The rest of the family agrees with Dad, you know," he called after me. "Aunt Linda and Uncle Paul think you're being selfish, making a big deal out of this." The statement stopped me cold. "You've already told the extended family." Trevor smirked. Dad explained the situation. "Everyone understands he did what was necessary for family harmony." The implications were clear. Dad was mobilizing family support, crafting a narrative where I was the unreasonable one for objecting to having my inheritance stolen. The betrayal was expanding beyond just Dad and Trevor, to include aunts, uncles, and cousins, who would now view me as the troublemaker disrupting family peace. That night I received calls from both Aunt Linda and Uncle Paul, each delivering carefully worded suggestions that I should let this go for the sake of the family. Neither directly addressed the forgery or theft, focusing instead on how Trevor has always struggled and your father was just trying to help both his sons in the ways they needed most. The gaslighting was so blatant it would have been laughable if it weren't so painful. Family members who had attended the will reading, who knew grandmother's wishes, were now pretending this criminal act was a reasonable family decision. I felt increasingly isolated, cut off from the support system I'd taken for granted. Even my cousin Emma, who had always been an ally, texted that while she understood my disappointment, family has to stick together through disagreements. Disagreements. As if fraud and theft were simple differences of opinion. Sleep-deprived and emotionally raw, I drove to the house the next morning hoping for one last chance to walk through the rooms before the new owners completely claimed the space. Laura Delaney was there alone, supervising painters in the living room. Her expression shifted between sympathy and discomfort when she saw me. "Mason, right. Look, I understand this is difficult, but my husband and I purchased this house in good faith." I know I said, surprised by the calm in my voice. "I'm not here to cause problems for you. I just wanted to see it one more time." Perhaps recognizing the grief beneath my anger, she nodded. "You can look around, but the painters need to work." Walking through those rooms one last time, seeing painters covering grandmother's carefully chosen colors with generic beige watching movers dismantle built-in bookshelves that had stood for decades, I felt a profound sense of loss that went beyond the financial value of the property. This house contained tangible connections to my mother and grandmother the only family members who had truly seen and valued me. In the upstairs hallway, I paused before the growth chart marked on the wall recording my height from ages 5 to 15. Laura found me there staring at those pencil marks that would soon be painted over. "We can take a photo of that for you before it's covered," she offered. Her kindness nearly broke me. I nodded, unable to speak, and continued my final tour of the house that should have been mine. Back at the hotel, I finally reached my breaking point. Years of accepting second place to Trevor, of seeking approval from a father who consistently prioritized my brother, of quietly building my own life separate from their dysfunction. All of it crashed down. I called my Chicago friend Marcus, the only person who knew the full history of my family dynamics. They did what Marcus's outrage provided the first validation I'd received since this nightmare began. "That's not just wrong, it's criminal. You need to fight this, Mason. Not just for the money, but because you deserve better than being their perpetual doormat." His words cut through the fog of hurt and confusion. This wasn't just about the house or money. It was about a lifetime pattern of being devalued, of having my needs considered secondary to Trevor's, of my achievements being used to justify giving him more, rather than celebrating what I'd accomplished. The next day, I requested a second meeting with Dad, hoping a calmer conversation might penetrate his certainty. He agreed, suggesting we meet at a local diner rather than his home. The neutral setting did nothing to soften his position. If anything, being in public forced him to double down to avoid admitting wrongdoing. "You've always been fine on your own, Mason," he said, stirring his coffee. "Trevor needs help. He always has. Your grandmother didn't understand that. So you decided to override her explicit wishes, to commit forgery and fraud." Dad flinched at the words but recovered quickly. "I did what was necessary for this family. Trevor would have been destroyed by those debts. And what about me? What about what I need?" "You." He looked genuinely puzzled. "You've never needed anything from me. You've made that abundantly clear with your independence." The statement revealed the twisted logic that had shaped our relationship for decades. My self-sufficiency, born partly from necessity after being repeatedly overlooked, had become justification for further neglect. Meanwhile, Trevor's dependence was rewarded with unlimited support and resources. "That's not how family is supposed to work, Dad. You don't punish capability and reward failure." "I'm not punishing you. I'm helping Trevor. By stealing from me." He sighed heavily, checking his watch. "I need to get back to work. I was hoping you'd be reasonable about this." As he stood to leave, I realized with absolute clarity that no argument would change his mind. In his worldview, taking my inheritance to bail out Trevor was not just acceptable but right. The house had never been mine in his eyes, despite grandmother's will, despite the law. Walking back to my hotel, I made my decision. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about standing up against a lifetime of being dismissed and devalued. For once, I wouldn't quietly accept being sacrificed for Trevor's benefit. I called Marcus again. "I need recommendations for the best lawyer specializing in inheritance fraud and elder law in Boston. Price is no object." It was time to fight back. The attorney's office was located in a converted brownstone near Boston Common, its understated elegance suggesting success without ostentation. Patricia Wilson, recommended by 3 separate legal contacts as the best elder law and inheritance fraud specialist in Massachusetts, greeted me with a firm handshake and direct gaze. "Tell me everything," she said once we were seated in her office. "Start from the beginning, and don't omit details even if they seem insignificant." For the next hour, I outlined the situation from grandmother's death through the discovery of the fraudulent sale. Patricia took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly listening with focused attention. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Your case has several strong elements. The will clearly states the house was left to you. The power of attorney document was forged. The timing of the sale suggests premeditation rather than a misunderstanding." She tapped her pen against her notepad. "However, we face challenges. Family courts often prefer mediation over litigation, especially when the dispute involves parents and children. And your father will likely claim he was acting in the family's best interest." "He stole nearly $800,000, I pointed out. "Yes, And that's why I believe we can build a compelling case. But first, we need more evidence. She slid a notepad across the desk. I need you to make a list of every potential witness who can confirm your grandmother's intentions regarding the house. Also, do you know if she kept the original copy of her will in a safe deposit box? The question triggered a memory. Grandmother had mentioned a safe deposit box at Boston First National, where she kept important documents. I'd completely forgotten about it in the chaos following her death. Patricia's eyes lit up at this information. We need to access that box immediately. If she kept original documents there, they could be crucial to our case. The next morning, armed with the death certificate and proof of my identity as a beneficiary, I visited Boston First National. The process took several hours, but eventually I was escorted to a private room with the contents of grandmother's safe deposit box. Inside, I found exactly what we needed. Original copies of her will dated 6 months before her death with explicit instructions that the house be left to me. Also included was a personal letter addressed to me written in her familiar handwriting. "My dear Mason," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm no longer here to protect what's rightfully yours. I've seen how your father favors Trevor and fears this might extend to my final wishes. This letter confirms my sound mind and absolute intention that my house pass directly to you upon my death. No one, not even your father, has the right to override this decision." The letter continued, expressing her love and confidence in me and her hope that the house would provide both financial security and a connection to family history. It was dated just 2 weeks before her death and signed not only by her but witnessed by her doctor and attorney. This document was gold, as Patricia confirmed when I brought it to her office. This establishes clear intent and sound mind. It directly counters any claim your father might make about acting on your grandmother's unstated wishes. With this foundation, we began building our case methodically. Patricia assigned a paralegal to interview neighbors, including Mrs. Abernathy, who provided statements about grandmother's frequent mentions of leaving the house to me. The paralegal also tracked down grandmother's bridge club friends, several of whom confirmed hearing her specific plans regarding the inheritance. The most damning evidence came from grandmother's personal journal, which I found among boxes of her belongings that had been hastily moved to Dad's garage during the house sale. The journal contained multiple entries expressing concern about Trevor's financial irresponsibility and Dad's enabling behavior. Richard called again, asking for money for Trevor. One entry read, "Claims it's for business school tuition, but I suspect another bailout for gambling debts." I refused. My responsibility now is protecting assets for Mason, who uses resources wisely. Another entry dated just a month before her death was even more explicit. "Met with Mr. Winters to update my will. Richard has been suggesting I distribute assets more evenly, which I suspect means giving Trevor control of the house. I've made it clear the house goes to Mason." Richard seemed unhappy but accepted my decision. Patricia was particularly interested in this entry. "This suggests your father knew exactly what the will contained and was already considering ways to circumvent it before your grandmother died." Meanwhile, our investigation uncovered the notary who had authenticated the forged power of attorney document. Facing potential criminal charges himself, he admitted that Richard had brought the document already signed, claiming I was out of the country and had authorized him to handle the property sale. The notary's statement provided further proof of deliberate fraud. Bank records revealed more troubling patterns. Dad had begun transferring funds from grandmother's accounts within days of her death, well before the will was officially processed. These transfers, along with the rapid house sale below market value, suggested not just opportunism, but premeditated financial exploitation. Throughout this process, Trevor made several attempts to contact me. His messages, evolving from casual dismissal of my concerns to increasingly desperate pleas as he realized the legal momentum was building. "You need to call off your lawyer," his final voicemail demanded. "Dad's under a lot of stress because of this. If you push this, things will get ugly for everyone." Some of Dad's business associates might not appreciate having family matters dragged into court. The thinly veiled threat only strengthened my resolve. I forwarded the voicemail to Patricia, who added it to our growing file of evidence. As our case solidified, Patricia presented me with strategic options. We have two potential approaches. We can pursue civil remedies demanding full restitution of the property value plus damages, or we can push for criminal charges, fraud, elder, financial abuse, and forgery. All carry potential jail time in Massachusetts. The thought of my father in jail despite everything gave me pause. What's the third option? Patricia smiled slightly. We prepare for both paths, but begin with a settlement offer. Your father returns the full sale amount plus damages and acknowledges his wrongdoing, or we proceed with both civil and criminal cases. He won't agree to that, I said. He still believes he was justified. People's perception of justification changes rapidly when facing prison time, Patricia replied. Let's see what happens when he understands the full consequences of his actions. With our strategy set, Patricia drafted a detailed letter outlining the evidence against my father, the potential civil and criminal penalties, and our settlement terms. The letter concluded with an invitation to meet with our legal team before we filed formal charges. Trevor called within hours of the letter's delivery, his voice shaking with anger and fear. What the hell are you doing, criminal charges? Are you trying to destroy this family? The family was damaged when Dad stole my inheritance, I replied calmly. This is just the consequence. He was trying to help me. By committing fraud against me. That's not help, Trevor. That's crime. There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice quieter. What if we return half? Dad's already spent some of it on my debts, but we could work out payments for the rest. Full restitution, or we proceed with all charges. Patricia will expect your father's response within 48 hours. As I ended the call, I felt a strange calm replacing the hurt and anger that had driven me for weeks. For the first time in my life, I was refusing to be the family sacrifice. Whatever happened next, I would no longer be the one expected to give up what was rightfully mine, so Trevor could be rescued from his own mistakes. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The conference room at Patricia Wilson's law office projected quiet authority with its oak table, leather chairs, and views of Boston Common. I arrived early, reviewing our strategy once more while Patricia arranged documents in precise stacks before her. Remember, she advised, stay calm regardless of what's said. Let me do most of the talking. Your father and his attorney will likely attempt to provoke an emotional response to undermine your credibility. Dad arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a silver-haired man carrying an expensive briefcase. Trevor followed behind them, though he hadn't been invited to the meeting. Patricia raised an eyebrow but nodded when I indicated it was acceptable for him to stay. Mr. Wright, Patricia began once everyone was seated. I'm Patricia Wilson, representing your son Mason in this matter. This is an opportunity to resolve our differences before formal legal proceedings commence. Dad's attorney, who introduced himself as James Harrington, responded with practiced cordiality. We appreciate the chance for discussion, though we believe this situation has been greatly misconstrued. My client was acting in good faith to address family financial needs. Patricia's smile remained pleasant as she opened the first folder. Let's clarify the facts, shall we? Elaine Wright's will explicitly left her house to Mason. Within weeks of her death, Richard Wright created fraudulent power of attorney documents, sold the property significantly below market value, and diverted the proceeds primarily to his other son's gambling debts. Harrington shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Wright believed he was honoring his mother's unstated wishes to provide for both her grandsons equitably. Interesting theory, Patricia replied, opening another folder. However, we have multiple documented statements from Mrs. Wright explicitly confirming her intention that the house go to Mason. She slid copies of grandmother's letter and journal entries across the table. As Harrington reviewed the documents, Dad's confident expression began to falter. Trevor, watching from a chair against the wall, leaned forward with growing concern. Additionally, Patricia continued, we have the notary's signed statement admitting the power of attorney document was improperly executed, bank records showing systematic withdrawal of funds prior to proper probate, and evidence of the Farkin property being intentionally undervalued for quick sale. She laid out each piece of evidence, methodically building an irrefutable case of premeditated fraud. I watched Dad's face as the reality of his situation became increasingly clear. The self-righteous certainty that had characterized our previous conversations was gradually replaced by something I'd rarely seen directed at me, respect tinged with fear. Harrington requested a brief recess to confer with his client. When they returned 20 minutes later, the attorney's demeanor had shifted noticeably. "We're prepared to discuss settlement terms," he announced. However, Mr. Wright maintains that his actions were motivated by family considerations rather than malicious intent. Patricia nodded. "Motivation is irrelevant to the facts of the case. Our terms are straightforward: full restitution of the property's fair market value, estimated at $820,000, plus $100,000 in damages for emotional distress and legal costs." "That's nearly $1 million, Trevor exclaimed from his corner. "Where are we supposed to get that kind of money?" Patricia turned her cool gaze to him. "Perhaps from whatever remains of the fraudulently obtained funds, or by selling other assets. The alternative is civil judgment, followed by criminal prosecution for fraud, forgery, and elder financial abuse. The latter carries potential incarceration." Dad paled visibly at the word incarceration. Harrington placed a restraining hand on his arm before he could speak. "We'll need assurance that criminal charges will be dropped if financial settlement is reached," the attorney countered. "We're prepared to focus solely on civil remedies if full restitution is made," Patricia agreed. "However, we require a signed admission of wrongdoing and public apology, in addition to financial compensation." "Public apology," Dad finally spoke, his voice strained. "You want to humiliate me?" I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. "I want acknowledgement of what you did, not just to me but to grandmother's memory and wishes." "I was protecting this family," he insisted, though with less conviction than before. "Trevor would have been ruined by those debts. So you ruined me instead." I kept my voice level despite the emotion rising in my chest. "You chose to sacrifice my inheritance rather than let Trevor face consequences for once." Trevor interjected. "Those guys weren't just debt collectors, Mason. They were dangerous. Dad was trying to keep me safe." "By committing crimes against me," I replied. "That wasn't protection. That was choosing one son over the other, like always." A heavy silence fell over the room. Dad stared at the documents spread across the table, evidence of his betrayal laid bare in black and white. "I never thought it would come to this," he finally said. "I never thought you'd actually fight back." The statement revealed more than he intended. All those years of quietly accepting second place, of building my life apart from their drama, had led him to believe I would accept this final injustice too. For the first time, I saw clearly how my independence had been misinterpreted as indifference, my self-sufficiency, as emotional detachment. "I've been fighting my whole life, Dad, just not in ways you recognized." Harrington cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could discuss payment terms. My client may need time to liquidate assets to meet these financial obligations." Patricia nodded. "We can structure a payment plan provided the initial sum of $300,000 is transferred within 30 days, with monthly payments thereafter." The negotiation continued for another hour, working through details of the settlement agreement. Throughout the discussion, Dad remained subdued, occasionally glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Trevor grew increasingly agitated as he realized the full financial implications, eventually storming out when it became clear Dad would have to sell his vacation property to meet the settlement terms. As the meeting concluded, Dad signed the preliminary agreement, acknowledging his wrongdoing and committing to full financial restitution. The formal apology would be delivered at a family gathering once the initial payment was made. When Harrington stepped out to make copies of the signed documents, Dad and I were left momentarily alone. He looked older than I remembered, the weight of consequences finally settling on his shoulders. "I convinced myself I was being fair," he said quietly, "balancing things between you and Trevor. By stealing what was legally mine." He winced. "I told myself you didn't need it, that you were successful on your own while Trevor needed help. That's been the story my entire life, Dad. Trevor needs help, so Mason gets less. Trevor struggles, so Mason's achievements don't matter." "That's not true," he protested, but without conviction. "It is true, and this time it crossed from unfair to illegal." I gathered my papers, preparing to leave. "You know what's ironic? If you'd just asked me for help with Trevor's situation, explained the danger he was in, I might have offered to sell the house voluntarily and share the proceeds. But you never considered that option, did you? The possibility clearly hadn't occurred to him. In his mind, I had always been the independent one needing nothing while Trevor's needs took precedence by default. Would you really have done that? He asked. We'll never know. You chose fraud instead of honest conversation. As Patricia returned with the finalized documents, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. I had finally stood up against the family pattern that had defined my life, but the victory came at the cost of whatever fragile relationship might have been possible with my father. Walking out of the office that day, I knew something fundamental had shifted, not just in how my father and brother saw me, but in how I saw myself. No longer the quiet one who stepped aside for family peace. No longer the reliable son whose needs could be indefinitely deferred. For better or worse, I had finally demanded the respect that had been withheld for decades. The long-term consequences remained to be seen, but in that moment I felt a weight lifting that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The settlement unfolded largely as agreed over the following months. Dad sold his lakeside vacation home to make the initial payment, and monthly installments followed from liquidating investment accounts. The full restitution would take 2 years to complete, but Patricia had structured the agreement with sufficient legal safeguards to ensure compliance. The question of criminal charges weighed on me heavily. Though we had grounds to pursue prosecution regardless of the civil settlement, I ultimately decided against it, not from any residual sense of family loyalty, but because incarceration seemed an empty punishment that wouldn't undo the damage already done. The financial consequences and public acknowledgement of wrongdoing seemed sufficient retribution for a man whose self-image was built on being the family patriarch and provider. With the first substantial payment in hand, I faced decisions about how to use the reclaimed inheritance. The house itself was gone, sold to the Delaney's, who had already begun extensive renovations. While legally I could have challenged their ownership as buyers of fraudulently sold property they had purchased in good faith, and displacing them felt unnecessarily punitive. Instead, I established the Elaine Wright Memorial Scholarship at grandmother's alma mater, dedicating $50,000 to support female architecture students. The gesture felt like a way to honor her memory beyond the physical structure she had left me, extending her legacy to future generations of creators and builders. The remaining funds allowed me to purchase a brownstone in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood, not far from my firm's offices. The property, built in 1902, possessed some of the same architectural character as grandmother's house, with bay windows and ornate woodwork that reminded me of her home. Renovating it became both a professional challenge and personal healing process, transforming the space while preserving historical elements that connected to my past. My relationship with Dad and Trevor entered a new phase characterized by careful distance rather than active conflict. The formal apology delivered at a small family gathering as specified in our agreement was clearly difficult for Dad. Standing before assembled relatives, many of whom had initially supported his actions, he acknowledged forging documents, selling property that wasn't his to sell, and violating both legal standards and family trust. I believed I was solving one problem, he admitted, voice strained but steady, but instead created a greater injustice. I apologized to Mason for taking what was rightfully his, and for betraying the trust between father and son. The words were correct, though I sensed they came more from legal necessity than genuine remorse. Still, the public acknowledgement shifted family dynamics immediately. Aunts and uncles who had pressured me to let it go for family peace now approached with awkward expressions of support, claiming they hadn't understood the full situation. Trevor's reaction proved more complicated. Initially, he alternated between resentment at losing his financial bailout and attempts to re-establish our former relationship through texts and calls that carefully avoided mentioning the legal proceedings. When these overtures received minimal response, he shifted to accusations that I had destroyed the family by involving lawyers instead of accepting Dad's decision. I maintained limited contact with both of them, exchanging occasional texts and obligatory holiday calls, but declining invitations for extended visits. The boundaries felt necessary for my own well-being, a recognition that genuine reconciliation would require changes neither seemed capable of making. Professional success provided unexpected consolation during this period of family estrangement. The junior partnership I had been offered before grandmother's death materialized with expanded responsibilities and creative control over several significant projects. Channeling energy into work that had always fulfilled me became a form of healing, allowing me to focus on creation rather than loss. Through therapy, I began recognizing patterns established in childhood that had shaped my adult responses. The tendency to quietly accept unequal treatment to build self-worth through achievement rather than connection to avoid conflict, even at personal cost, all stemmed from years of family dynamics where Trevor's needs consistently superseded mine. Understanding these patterns didn't erase them, but provided a framework for conscious change. I also discovered the importance of chosen family. Friends like Marcus, who had supported me throughout the legal battle, proved more reliable and nurturing than blood relations. I invested more deeply in these relationships, creating holiday traditions and regular gatherings that filled the space left by distancing from Dad and Trevor. Occasionally, painful moments still surfaced, passing grandmother's old neighborhood during a business trip to Boston, discovering a childhood photograph where Dad actually had his arm around me instead of Trevor, hearing that Trevor had accumulated new gambling debts, but without access to my inheritance, was finally facing genuine consequences without bailout. During our most recent phone call, Dad ventured into territory we had mostly avoided since the settlement. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began hesitantly, "about how I might have handled Trevor's situation differently." And I prompted when he fell silent. "You were right. I never considered just talking to you honestly. I assumed you wouldn't help because—" He paused again. "Because you've always seen me as the one who doesn't need anything I finished for him." "Yes, the independent one. The successful one. Those aren't bad things to be, Dad." "No, but they became excuses. For giving you less. For expecting less from Trevor." The admission surprised me, suggesting reflection I hadn't thought him capable of. Whether it signaled potential for genuine change remained uncertain, but it offered a glimmer of possibility where I had seen only permanent estrangement. Trevor's journey proved more predictable. Without Dad's unlimited financial support, he cycled through jobs and relationships with the same instability as before. Our interactions remained superficial and infrequent, both of us aware of the chasm created by his role in the inheritance theft. Perhaps someday he would develop the self-awareness to address his part in the damage done, but I no longer placed my emotional well-being on that possibility. The most profound lesson from this painful chapter came unexpectedly during a visit from Mrs. Abernathy, who had traveled to Chicago for her granddaughter's college graduation. Over tea in my new home, she commented on the transformation she had witnessed. "Your grandmother always said you had a quiet strength," she told me, "but I think even she would be surprised by how you stood up for yourself. Not with anger or vengeance, but with dignity and determination." Her observation crystallized something I had been feeling but couldn't articulate. The house itself had never been the true inheritance. Grandmother's real gift was showing me that I deserved to be valued, that my needs mattered, that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, but necessary for genuine relationships. Standing up to Dad and Trevor hadn't been about punishment or even justice in some abstract sense. It had been about finally declaring that I would no longer accept being the family member whose inheritance could be stolen, whose achievements could be dismissed, whose needs could be eternally deferred in service to others. The brownstone I now called home wasn't grandmother's Victorian, but it carried something of her spirit in its solid construction and thoughtful design. More importantly, it represented a choice I had made for myself, an investment in my own future, rather than a concession to family patterns of inequity and manipulation. The betrayal that began this journey remains a painful chapter in my life. Yet from that pain came a strength and clarity I might never have discovered otherwise. By fighting for what was rightfully mine, I found something more valuable than property or money: the conviction that I deserved the same respect and consideration I had always extended to others. As I look toward the future, I carry grandmother's true legacy forward, not in a physical structure, but in the knowledge that standing up for oneself isn't selfish but essential. Sometimes the most profound act of self-respect is simply refusing to be the family sacrifice any longer. Have you ever had to stand up to family who took advantage of your good nature? Share your story in the comments. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about finding strength in difficult situations. Remember, sometimes the most important boundaries are the ones we set with those closest to us. Thank you for listening, and may you find the courage to protect what's rightfully yours.